Despite making up a good majority of the people that play Overwatch, it's pretty rare for players around the range of gold or lower to have somewhere to get a chance to show their stuff. There's the occasional GG&A tournament or open division, but for the most part the teams in those are either way overprepared or don't care enough to give a true challenge. For whatever the reason, and however the way they heard about it, the league's new Novice Division going into Season 2 had drawn quite the crowd. In the past, this caliber of player was technically able to sign up, but they were never given many chances to prove their worth compared to the higher ranks. Now, however, they finally be given their shot to play against other gold and below peers in about the most fair environment to date, at least by League Zero's standards. What no one expected was that the new division to showcase a different side of competitive Overwatch would come unexpected challenges as well. Many stories were carved in stone during Season 2, the stories of dominance, underdogs, upsets, friendships, and drama. Lots and lots of drama. This is going to be a long one, so buckle up and enjoy the ride. Season 2, Season in Review, Novice Edition.
One of the largest challenges for staff and managers alike moving into the pre-draft period of Season 2 Novice was that almost everyone was brand new. With a whopping total of 4 community veterans signed up, nearly 99% of the division's base was made up of rookies. There were a few familiar faces like Revolve, Ace Flash, Paradox, and Tyranitar, as well as Maverick and Navino providing fresh blood to the role of management. Immediately, the managers got to work bringing on support staff to help them scout and prepare for the upcoming season, though the exact approach varied widely across the division itself. Navino would bring in players from his pre-established Wisdom team outside of the community to help coach his new Wisdom Academy. One Trick Wonders build around a core of Season 1 players for the new management, and Tyranitar looked to his friends to build up Geometric. Though while half of Novice was busy connecting old ties, the rest would create new bonds, such as Paradox working with Arrow to establish Hyperflex, Maverick taking over the famed Black Chat branding and starting from scratch, and Revolve snatching up a few coaches from the general community to rebuild Rio. Some teams held pugs nearly every day, whereas others stuck mostly to smaller private scouting sessions to learn which players gelled with each other's personalities the best. Everyone had a different plan, and while many of the teams were looking at the same players, each could only be drafted once. This meant that they needed backups for if and when their first picks were sniped, giving those gems hidden in the rough a chance as well. The captains were soon picked up, stealing some of the immediate players with superstar potential early on. This lessened the pool for those coveted first few draft rounds a bit, though the teams are all admittedly still on edge about their plans possibly crumbling apart. The draft came and went, and the individual plans each team had become immediately obvious. Rio had gone for players with mechanical ability with the hopes of coaching them to work together as a team. Hyperflex had gone for a mix of talent and good personalities. Platchat picked up a mix of lower and higher ranked players in the hopes of coaching their performance up by the mid-season. Geometric picked up players almost exclusively on the higher SR range for Novice. One Trick Wonders tried to go for players that would cooperate with manager and their game plans, and Wisdom had done an immense amount of scouting to find players everyone else overlooked. Which strategy was best was yet to be proven, but everyone would soon have their chance in the first set of games just a few weeks away.
Right off the bat, the game devs decided to throw a monkey wrench into every single team's plan, with a giant update that shifted the meta to be more brawl favored instead of the double shield that was dominating up until that point. The reaction was mixed across the division, with some teams having mastered the previous meta, while others felt the new May McCree brawl was a breath of fresh air. As a result of this change happening just 1 week prior to the first set of games, most were expecting there to be a more even playing field. In a sense, the analysts were correct in their assumption. Instead of strategy, it would be teamwork and coordination deciding who'd come out on top for week 1. Some teams came out swinging a lot harder than what was expected of them, while others flopped hard enough to make the entire community wince in pain. When the dust settled from the first set of games, the teams that practiced the hardest and had organized plans were the ones that came out on top. Geometric surprised everyone by utterly stomping Rio 3-0, despite the fact that most were expecting it to be the closest match of the weekend. Rio couldn't pull it together during the game despite putting up good performances in scrims and having good mentalities throughout the match. Geometric, on the other hand, had been scrimming more rigorously than anyone had expected, and had built up their fundamentals to an impressive degree. This had two things happen that started a chain of events that would go on to define much of Geometric's image for the rest of the season. The first is that Corbs was given the post-match interview, where he proceeded to trash-talk the daylights out of Rio. This immediately put a target on his team's back. Geo became known as that toxic team, despite only a few of them ever contributing to the banter, though in all fairness the ones that did trash talk took it to an impressive level. The second thing that reared its ugly head after the Rio game is that the majority of the Novice Division started to become suspicious of Geometric's support line, namely Hitori Hanzo and Stormy. There were a few claims popping up occasionally from preseason scrims, but now a large crowd among the other teams became more vocal in believing that these two players were Smurfs. On top of the toxic perception issue, this forced Geo to turtle up and to avoid talking with the rest of their division for a large part of the season.
The Hyperflex Plot Chat game was much closer than anyone was predicting going into Week 1, as most analysts expected Hyperflex to drastically outclass their opponents. Despite the public's perception, Plot Chat put up an admirable attempt and just barely lost in Map 5. As everyone still believed Hyperflex to be a top 2 team in Novice, Plot Chat's stunks had skyrocketed practically overnight. What makes Plot Chat's efforts so impressive after the fact is that they were suffering from both of their main tanks having time commitment issues, meaning they had very little time to practice with either of the players meant to be the anchor of the team. They knew what they needed to work on, and they brought in Abrexis and Calyx to coach them up to the level they wanted to be at. Hyperflex, on the other hand, was receiving a large amount of structure and organization from their head coach Arrow, which helped them keep their composure during this first nail-biting game. However, along with the start of the regular season, Arrow began to focus more on his Tier 3 teams, meaning Hyperflex lost a good chunk of their coaching staff for the following few weeks. Arguably one of the closest first games of Season 2 as a whole, and the biggest surprise of the first night of Novice, was One Trick Wonders vs Wisdom Academy. Wisdom had an impressive amount of planning going into their preseason, and as such, were expected to be towards the top of the standings alongside Hyperflex. What almost no one expected was for OTW to bring Wisdom to the very brink, just barely falling short in Map 5. Nevertheless, One Trick really impressed everyone who watched, and seriously brought their name into contention when talking about the early leaders of the division. All the more impressive when you consider the fact that OTW didn't have any official coaches yet, and none of their management was confident in their ability to coach. Sure enough, OTW got to show what they were really made of in Game 2, clean sweeping Plot Chat. This, alongside the fact that Geometric beat out Hyperflex 3-1, meant that most spectators were overestimating Hyperflex and Plot Chat, and drastically underestimating One Trick. Wisdom also swept Rio that week, however this was almost a backdrop to the other games as Rio's cracks were already showing. Most analysts' predictions include Wisdom winning and Rio losing until either team would prove them wrong, which as we know, wouldn't happen for quite some time, if ever, as the season progressed. The most significant event to happen in the aftermath of the second game, however, was Geometric losing Hitori Hanzo. Staff had determined she was inappropriately placed in Novice when she was really an intermediate level player, and was transferred up to Wait What. Thankfully, Geo had Flintless just riding the bench up until that point, so they had another main support ready to fill in, but losing Hanzo was obviously going to hurt them. At the time, league admins were expecting the smurfing allegations would settle down for a while now that Hanzo was moved up, but unfortunately, this action had just the opposite effect. Stormy was now the sole target for an onslaught of suspicion, which would affect him for the rest of the season.
In the brief period from just after Game 2 to the start of Game 4 for Novice bore witness to some of the most drastic changes in rosters and support staff that would go on to define certain teams for the remainder of the season. Just to name a few, OTW picked up King Genius as their head coach just after their second game against Plot Chat. Plot Chat traded Nice to Rio for No You and Bob's, and Hyperflex finally acquired an active coach in Dizzy just after their third game. One Trick Wonders and Plot Chat arguably came out on top out of all these moves, as shortly afterwards they began or continued their upwards trends. Wisdom was still undefeated by this point, and while they had worried about some matchups such as Geometric, none of their opponents, aside from OTW at the time, had really given them a run for their money. Geometric was visibly struggling to deal with the loss of Hitori, and Corbs constantly tilting at the team during these tough times didn't make things better for their mentality. Neither Hyperflex nor Rio could catch a break, and while Hyperflex had at least a win under their belt from Game 1, their mentality wasn't very hopeful. Plot Chat was the only team in the bottom half of the standings that had confidence in their ability to turn their season around. They were improving slowly and steadily, and even managed to take Wisdom to a Map 5. PC couldn't close out that series, but it was close enough to add to their momentum going into the second half of the season. In the meantime, Wisdom and OTW were looking to stay at the top of the leaderboard, and everyone else was basically trying to keep their heads above the water. The time between Games 5 and 6 was a weird one, since everyone knew things were going to change compared to Game 1, but no one was confident in exactly how just yet.
With the second half of the season arriving, and everyone ramping up to face their opponents for the second time, a new factor was thrown into the mix: hero bans. While players at the novice skill level generally don't have to worry too much about what the meta currently is, comfort picks are much more important to players' performances. If a team didn't have a specific niche filled because the hero bans for that week screwed them over, they'd just have to deal with it. The reception of this change was mixed, with some teams finding a lot more success with the constantly changing meta, while others felt like their hero pools weren't wide enough to let them adapt properly. One Trick Wonders, in particular, note that they felt extremely limited due to their lack of DPS players at that point in the season. Despite managing to take Wisdom to a map 5 again, they didn't quite pull out the win in their rematch, but OTW proved that they could still keep up with the best of their competition. Platchat, on the other hand, appeared to be firing on all cylinders then. They were in the process of building up momentum for the past couple weeks, and were ready to take their revenge against Hyperflex for their 5-map thriller in week 1. Sure enough, they won very confidently and continued on their streak of dominance for weeks to come. PC's coaches were becoming slightly less active around this point, however it didn't affect their performance too much as everyone knew their job and what needed to be worked on. Hyperflex, on the other hand, had finally reached their tipping point. For weeks, the active players were asking management to deal with the inactive or underperforming members, but to no avail. They had reached a tipping point, and after long talks among the roster, Paradox decided to step down to a player/coaching position, allowing Regan to fill in as the manager for the remainder of the season. Tons of roster moves followed, specifically dropping much of the bench players and replacing them with free agents, who were more willing to put in the work to improve. Rio's coaches started to take a more active approach to the roster around week 6, looking for any shifts in the lineup that were deemed necessary. Most notably, Chaos was brought in as main tank, and unfortunately she would later be found out to be a diamond-level smurf after the season had ended. Unfortunately for Rio, nothing would truly change their success in the regular season. They managed to take more maps and make games look closer, but they were still considerably behind the rest of the division at that point.
Geometric had made a few roster moves around week 7, some of which would prove to be absolutely vital to their success for the remainder of the season. Most notably, they would pick up Silent Sword on main tank, which would take a lot of pressure off the team for not having to deal with Corpse constantly tilting if they ever lost momentum in the game. They would share playtime for a few weeks before Silent Sword would eventually take over as the starting main tank for the rest of the season. Geo's morale would slowly improve from then on. In a large but somewhat predicted upset, Platchat managed to claim revenge against OTW in a thrilling 6-map series. This effectively cemented Platchat's redemption arc as being complete as they claimed the title of a top team in Novice. However, One Trick Wonders began to desperately look around for answers about how they could deal with their constant struggle against hero pools. Their games felt much closer than they wanted them to be, but they could only work around their DPS's comfort picks so much when they were constantly being banned. The team's head coach, King Genius, would pull out a niche strategy from a former Open Division team of his, which would eventually become the start of the now infamous OTW Bastion Cup. While this drew a ton of criticism from the rest of the division, the team had finally found their answer, playing heroes that would almost never be banned at any point in time. Despite all their effort and roster moves, and despite some great individual performances from a few of their players, Hyperflex failed to find their new groove. The lineup may have changed, but the results were still the same. The team just couldn't pull out a win against the majority of their opponents. They seemed to be completely stuck in the lower end of their bracket, which led to most of their members to put less effort into the remainder of the season. Towards the last few weeks of the regular season, the tensions surrounding Storm were starting to bubble to the surface once again, mostly surrounding the OTW Geo rematch in week 10. Geo had lost pretty handily to Wisdom the week prior, but Storm had an incredible performance which allowed Geo to take a single map, which seemingly worried the One Tricks. The game was incredibly close, but ultimately, Geo did claim their vengeance in map 5. Staff were once again pressured to look into the potential smurfing situation. However, no new evidence was presented at that time and the outcome was the same as before. The only change was that the majority of Geometric were starting to get tired with playing the villains and admitted to staff that they specifically avoided drama from then on, minus Corpse. The remaining few games left in the season ended on relatively exciting notes. Platchat was denied their perfect half-season and failed to deny Wisdom of their perfect regular season. Wisdom became the second team in league history to do so, and the first since Season 0's Go Again. On a similar but less happy note, Rio Redemption became the first team in league history to ever go winless in the regular season. There were a few teams that drew close to that mark, such as Season 0 Easy Clap or Season 1 Platchat, but up until that point, even the worst teams managed to have one good week to break their losing streak. It wasn't exactly where they had wanted to be compared to the beginning of the season, but Rio couldn't do anything at that point except move forward and prepare for their playoff run.
One tragic turn of events that happened just before the quarterfinals could start was that it was found out that Wisdom's star off-tank player Splash was actually longtime community veteran Time, who was actually a high diamond main tank player. This unfortunately meant that Time was banned, and while Wisdom were completely unaware of the Smurf among them, it robbed them of their starter nonetheless. Thankfully, they had obviously secured the number 1 seed in Novice, giving them an extra week to figure things out while everyone else played the quarterfinals, and they would even get to choose their opponents for the semifinals. Now, most teams in Novice admitted to practicing much harder going into the playoffs than they had for the regular season. All besides Platchat, who had taken a short break instead of preparing for their game against Hyperflex. The players were extremely confident in their ability to win after such a miraculous comeback in the regular season, and the coaches were a lot less active at this time. Hyperflex, on the other hand, was preparing like they had never done before. They weren't sure about their chances going very far in the playoffs, but they didn't care about that. They had one goal in mind: ruin Platchat's quarterfinals. This single-minded determination from Hyperflex initially didn't pay off despite the extra hours put into scrimming and VOD reviewing in the days leading up to the game. Platchat took an early 2-0 lead in the series, and things were looking dire for the struggling underdogs. However, they didn't let their position get to their heads. They had managed to make both maps very close losses, and used that momentum to slowly turn the tide one map at a time. Little by little, Hyperflex evened out the series until they had finally reached map 5, and utterly rolled through the overly complacent Platchat, completing the reverse sweep and ruining everyone's predicted playoff brackets. The other quarterfinals match was less exciting, to say the least. Geometric weren't taking anything for granted and treated Rio as if they could really pull off an amazing upset. Unfortunately, Rio struggled with the exact same problems they had all season long and fell 3-0, ending their season with an abysmal 0-11 record. The first winless team in league history, and also the third season in a row where they exited the playoffs in the first round. Wisdom had managed to cobble together a new plan by putting Pineapple in as the starting off-tank, which worked reasonably well. He certainly wasn't up to the level of Splash, but that's to be expected since he wasn't a Smurf. Nevertheless, Wisdom put an end to Hyperflex's momentum swiftly and secured their spot in the grand finals. The other game of OTW versus Geometric was, oh god, where to begin with this one? As tradition by that point, tensions surrounding Storm were at an absolute tipping point. It felt as if the entire Novice Division was going to riot if Geometric made it to the grand finals, but yet again nothing new was brought to the table as evidence against this supposed Smurf. The game proceeded as normal for a little while, despite mostly everyone rooting against Geometric in this case. It wasn't until late into the first map that the first serious problems arose. Blizzard server errors like never before had hit, forcing the game back to the lobby in the middle of a control round. Team management was brought into a voice chat and eventually agreed on what to do about it. Both teams were starting to get tired after just a single map, but for now everything was mostly stable. OTW took the first map, and the series continued on to Anubis where they tied before going over to King's Row. Even more server errors plagued the match, as once again the game was sent back to the lobby, but this time it wasn't as simple as sending the lobby back to a specific control point just to play out that round. The crash had happened in the middle of the second round, when OTW looked to be the clear favorites to take the demanding lead over Geo's time bank. The teams once again managed to come to an agreement where neither was happy, therefore everyone was happy, and they continued on. Geo eventually took the third map and evened out the series 1-1 with one tie. And that is where everything took a turn for the worse. Geometric had insisted that a decent number of their players couldn't play past 10 PM Eastern Time due to in-real-life problems, and requested that the series be delayed into a further date. One Trick Wonders gave conflicting responses to this request, at times both saying they were fine with a reschedule and that they wanted Geometric to forfeit the game if they could no longer play at that moment. League staff tried to be as fair as possible to make sure that the semifinals match wasn't going to end in a forfeit of all things, so they initially allowed the reschedule, but of course the drama didn't end there. After getting into a voice chat with the majority of Novice Division's management, One Trick Wonders had begun requesting that the match resume that same night, despite the fact that the call was made to reschedule nearly half an hour prior to then. Staff reached out to Geometric to figure out exactly why their players were unable to finish the game that night, which led to the decision that there was no good reason for the delay, and the match would continue. Both teams were forced back into the lobby, and their lineups at this time were less than pretty. OGW had the majority of their intended roster still around, however Geometric was effectively in shambles. Alianos was notably gone, as it was incredibly early in the morning for him, and he had gone to sleep. The lineup shifted around a bit depending on the map, but it was generally Silent Sword for Storm on Hitscan, SD Awesome, Flintlaz, and Corbs on Flex support of all things. Emotions were running high, and plenty of mistakes were made, both in play and in decision making. Geometric were running on sleep deprivation and pure rage, and were out for blood. The series ended in a seething 3-2 with one draw, and the only reason OTW got a second map win is because Geo's coach Kobe coached mid-map, causing them to forfeit Route 66. It was a night that just about everyone wishes they could forget, and somewhat fortunately nothing beyond King's Row was permanently archived. So, despite tensions being as hot as the sun, the stage was set for the final match. The team that had dominated everything in their path up until that point, and the team almost everyone regarded as the villains of Novice. Wisdom versus Geometric was shaping up to be a battle unlike anything anyone had seen before, promising to be absolutely nothing like the previous 2 times these teams had clashed. Everything is on the table, and there was nothing left to lose. Wisdom was admittedly worried about their off-tank situation still, and Geometric was running off of an adrenaline high like no other. The grand final started relatively eventfully, with both teams duking it out, trading blow for blow. Putting much of Novice's fears to rest, Geo was not going to steamroll their way to a trophy so easily. The first couple maps in the series went back and forth consistently, and by the end of map 2 everything was caught in a deadlock. Map 3 is where Geometric really started to shine, as they gained a slight edge in the speed of their play and never looked back. Wisdom put up a valiant effort and made every single map in the series extremely close, but in the end, Geo would go to close it out 4-1. There is a lot to be said about Novice as a whole. This was the first time League Zero had given a chance to players this low in the SR range, and in many regards it was a success beyond our wildest dreams. There's a lot to learn from this season, and a lot we'll be looking into improving moving into Season 3, but I'm personally very confident we can iron out those kinks. At its worst, Novice became a cesspit of middle school level drama that threatened to ostracize a team for something no one can prove they did. But at its best, it was an unforgettable introduction into what Overwatch can be, and the kind of community it can provide. A few of the star players from Season 2 Novice have already gone on to hit higher ranks such as Diamond and even Masters for a select few. And that's really what this whole thing is about, giving everyone the opportunity to find their place and reach their goals. Maybe these players will never hit that level of being able to go far in the path to pro like some of our alumni from higher divisions, but that's not the point. As long as we as a community can give them something to look forward to genuinely enjoy, and something they can't get anywhere else, then I'd say we're doing a pretty good job. On behalf of all of staff, we would like to send out a huge thank you to everyone who's involved in Season 2's Novice Division. Despite it sometimes feeling like no one paid attention to such a low-ranked division, I can say with certainty that, despite the drama, this was one of the most fun divisions we've ever had to deal with in the history of the league.